Okay, hey everybody, this is Dr. Cadwell, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about gluten. We'll make this a relatively, well, I'll go as quick as I always say that, and sometimes it ends up going a little bit long. But I think this is an important thing to cover, especially for those of you that are on the program right now. Obviously, while you're on the program, you're not consuming any gluten-containing foods. And I want to help you to understand the benefits of that, especially in the United States right now, and why, many people have decided to go to a drastically reduced gluten-containing diet, or have just decided to go gluten-free altogether. I happen to be a very passionate cyclist and mountain biker, and so I like to watch some of the professional cycling events. Right now we have the Tour de France going on, and it's interesting. Several years ago, several professional cycling teams decided to go gluten-free because they were seeing because they noticed how much more rapidly they were recovering from their rides, and just how much better they felt overall, and just all the really tremendous health benefits they were seeing. So anyway, gluten, the gluten issue's been going on for quite a while, and 10 years ago, as little as 10 years ago, eating gluten-type foods was, not necessarily very tasty. So the good news is that because we're in such a good place right now, a lot of people are able to create very tasty meals that are gluten-free. So at any rate, what is gluten? Well, gluten it's a protein, is what it is, and it's really most commonly found in wheat and rye and barley and things like that. And it's a protein called gluten, made up of glutenin and gliadin molecules. And what happens is when it gets wet or in the presence of water, it starts to form a sticky or elastic bond. So you're also going to find gluten in a lot of processed foods, and unfortunately, they're not going to be labeled. And so for people that eat a very high processed food diet, not only are you consuming a lot of dead food, which you've already talked about a lot previously, but you're consuming a lot of these glutens. So now you can also, in these processed foods, and why we want people to read ingredients just in general and understand what's in a food. You may see gluten, in labels, but it's not going to be labeled gluten. It's going to show up under other names, such as like a starch, starches or malts or natural flavorings or texturized vegetable proteins or hydrolyzed vegetable proteins. They're going to try and hide them in the wording. So understanding what these things are is really important. So and the reason why is because there's so much literature now that's beginning to show the detrimental health effects that can be created by gluten. And you may not have a gluten sensitivity, and really all that means is you don't develop necessarily the gastric distress, or maybe some of the other symptoms that people that do have a gluten sensitivity that experience. There's a guy named Dr. David Perlmutter, who's written a book called The Grain Brain. He actually is a neurologist. He's really big into Alzheimer's disease and addressing the Alzheimer's issue through diet. And interestingly enough, one of the big things that he actually promotes is eating a very high-fat diet, which we talk about, healthy fats, that is, but very healthy fats. But he also is a big proponent of being gluten-free, in other words, just avoiding glutens. And I won't go into all the reasons why, but he, as a neurologist, is recommending this because of the effects that he is seeing gluten have on people neurologically speaking, cognitively speaking. So how does gluten potentially damage our health, or what does it do? Well, first of all, when you look at the word itself, gluten, it actually literally means glue. So gluten is a Latin for glue. And it's the sticky properties of gluten that ultimately hold bread and cake and pastries and things like that together. And so what can happen in some of these things in bread that many people are eating is that there can even be additional extra gluten added in order to create a more spongy type texture, and that's getting added to a lot of breads, okay? But it's these glue type properties, these sticky binding type properties, that are also going to ultimately potentially interfere with breakdown and ultimately the absorption of nutrients, not only from the gluten-containing food itself, but also nutrients that would be eaten in the same meal with those gluten-containing foods also, okay? And so this can start to, the consumption of these glue-type foods, it can almost be thought of as like eating, a big, glued-together lump of, tape, that just sits in your gut. And obviously, if you imagine eating a big ball of tape, sticky tape, it's going to certainly create potential problems with proper digestion. So when this gluten, which comes in that's undigestible, really comes in, it can trigger your immune system to begin to attack over time the lining of the small bowel, your small intestinal tract. Which that's where when you have these people that have severe gluten sensitivities can develop these bowel challenges where they have constipation and diarrhea and abdominal pain. Sometimes they get nauseous. They can start to experience a whole bunch of these symptoms. And the thing is the more you consume this over time, and this is really what it is. I've always told people the loss of health is really a process. It's not an event unless you're run over by a truck. It's the accumulation of these things over time that start to create problems. And then when you start to add in the reality that so many people are just being thrown drugs to try and manage all these symptoms, not only do you have these food-like substances that are coming in and creating gut irritability and gut and digestive problems, but you've got these drugs which ultimately begin to create challenges with the digestive tract also. So these things, it becomes sort of this perfect storm that builds up. And so over time, the small intestine, your small gut, becomes more and more damaged and inflamed due to what's going on. And this can then start to create some major absorption challenges. In other words, what we call malabsorption of key nutrients, for the body, which ultimately leads to nutrient deficiencies. It can lead to anemias. It can lead to mineral absorption issues, which can ultimately lead to osteopenia or osteoporosis. And the list goes on and on and on. I mentioned earlier that Dr. David Perlmutter, and why he's gotten so interested in this is because the symptoms that he's referring to are very heavily neurologically and psychologically based, and many people don't think about their cognitive function or their neurologic health when they're consuming a high gluten type food, a bread or a cake or something like that or a refined food of some sort, and we talk a lot about the gut-brain barrier or the gut-brain connection. So and people that have digestive issues, many people also have associated, cognitive challenges, fogginess, brain fogginess, lack of, mental clarity. They start to become forgetful over time. This is what that Dr. David Perlmutter talks about, dementia leading to Alzheimer's and all that sort of stuff. So it becomes sort of this downward spiral that can begin to occur over time, on top of the fact that you can begin to see not just the nutrient deficiency, the mineral deficiency, the anemias, the osteopenias, the osteoporosis, but also you can start to see skin problems with people, joint problems with people, muscle problems, liver problems, So once again, when you're bringing these things into the body and there's no nutrient value to them, or even worse, they start to interfere with nutrient absorption, nutrient breakdown, mineral absorption, that's where you can begin to understand the decline that begins to occur for people. So why is this? Why have we seen this, precipitous rise? And one thing that's pointed out in the literature, see, I want to read you some, but one of the things that's been pointed out is just very, very simply that wheat has changed in a big way over the last 50 to 100 years here in this country. It's a very, very heavily grown crop in the U.S. and the Western world in general, but what it is today is not what it was for people that consumed it 100 years ago and even 50 years ago. Okay. And we've seen a substantial increase in a condition called celiac disease and just overall gluten intolerance since, the mid-1900s. And a lot of people are beginning to feel or believe that, and it's not just their thought, it's actually coming from research as well, but this rise in celiac disease and gluten intolerance doesn't have to do with better diagnosis, but that it is a very real issue, and that the dramatic changes are really more to do with the dietary changes that we've experienced in terms of the high processed foods and the glutens, and then the chemicals that are actually added to the wheat before it's harvested, which I'm going to talk about here in just a second. But the proportion of gluten in wheat has really increased substantially as a result of hybridization of the grains. Wheat, take this from Dr. Mercola, actually said that until the 19th century, wheat was also usually mixed with other grains, beans, and nuts. Pure wheat flour has been milled into refined white flour only during the last 200 years. So this resulting high gluten refined grain diet most of us have had since we were babies really is not a part of the diet of our previous generations. So our digestive tracts were not made to consume on a heavy level this this stuff that's just all gluey and stuck together. And so the large consumption of it is problematic for the gut, and it starts to lead to this thing which I've talked about for over a decade now. This thing called leaky gut syndrome, and I've seen a lot of people over the years with fibromyalgia, and fibromyalgia is really kind of interesting. It's this diagnosis that's given to people, typically as a junk diagnosis, and it doesn't mean that the symptoms that people have, which are basically a laundry list of symptoms underneath this word fibromyalgia, aren't real, but it's typically given to people when they don't know what to do with them. And then they're oftentimes told, well, they're just crazy. It's all in their head. And unfortunately, that has to do with, once again, when the model is purely about symptom management, but the body has begun this breakdown so dramatically, the drugs don't work. They're actually, over time, going to create more problems. But one of the biggest issues that I've identified and seen is this idea of leaky gut. And gluten, we're finding, can certainly trigger and contribute in a heavy way to this leaky gut issue. There's this gentleman, Dr. Alessio Fasano, who happens to be the director for the Center of Celiac Research in the state of Massachusetts. And he very bluntly says mankind did not evolve to eat gluten and therefore cannot digest it properly. Research suggests the human gut views gluten as a foreign invader against which it must mount an immune response. And Dr. Fasano believes that this is true for everyone. So even if you, once again, like I said at the beginning, do not have the sensitivity issues that another person may have in terms of the gut discomforts or the diarrhea or the constipation or the joint pains or whatever it is, he still believes that this gluten can create a problem for you. So it may remain relatively subclinical for a period of years, but the chronic or constant consumption of it can ultimately lead to challenges. So, it doesn't mean, he says, it doesn't mean that everyone has to avoid gluten. And he said that some people can handle gluten without clinical consequences, but it's the others that that develop challenges which ultimately become more at risk for more severe complications. Okay, so what he found was about 16 years ago, he and his research team found that gluten stimulates a molecule in the gut called zonulin. And zonulin is a protein that will trigger the opening of tight junctions within the gut. See, the gut is what we call a semi-permeable membrane. In other words, it's kind of like having a secret handshake. There's only certain things that should be absorbed through the gut to ultimately get into the bloodstream to get to the other parts of the body and serve as key nutrients to help rebuild the body. Well, when gluten comes in and it stimulates this protein zonulin, it actually begins to break these tight junctions and starts to create a more permeable gut, a more permeable membrane. this then becomes referred to as leaky gut. And when you develop this leaky gut issue, it allows, larger food particles and foreign substances and things that aren't supposed to be in the bloodstream actually into the bloodstream. Now, when these things get into the bloodstream that are not supposed to be there, there's a system in your body referred to as the immune system, which mounts an attack. And when the immune system mounts an attack on things, it creates inflammation in the body. And when you start to develop whole body inflammation and discomfort along with the gut distress and everything else, it starts to create the symptomatology very similar to what people are labeled in terms of fibromyalgia. So one of the big things that I would do with people that had fibromyalgia is we would go to work on their gut first and foremost. And the beautiful thing about Nutrimost and the Nutrimost program is that that's a big part of what's getting fixed right off the bat too. There's so many good things that are happening on the Nutrimost program, but one of the big things is you're starting to get gut healing to happen. And as a byproduct of that, if you're an individual that's got a leaky gut challenge, you're gonna feel a substantial change in a big way. Now, the program itself, Nutrimost itself, is very, very anti-inflammatory, which many of you already know. So even if you don't have leaky gut, you're going to see a great response from an inflammatory perspective. But if you do have leaky gut, boy, does it start to feel amazing when you get that under control. So it's really pretty incredible as it begins to happen. So when that happens and these things get into your body that aren't supposed to be there, and it raises the immune response within the body, it can also start to create an increase in your risk of developing, certain autoimmune conditions as well. And that is certainly something that you don't want to experience, and there's a lot of people, it seems like the diagnosis of autoimmune conditions has been drastically on the rise. And it's very interesting to see that, now there's a culmination of things that are going on here, but there just is such a perfect storm of things happening with, 70% of Americans taking at least one drug right now, the refined food industry basically dominating the market, giving people very few options as they see it. Now, you guys that are on the program obviously are beginning to realize that's not the case. Because you're learning how to read labels and you're learning how to understand ingredients, you're learning how to eat real food and cook real food, and you're also doing something else which is really important, is you're hopefully converting to organic food. And that kind of takes me into the next reason why we talk about eating organic food, is because of how wheat, as an example, and this what we're talking about today, how it's treated. And this treatment of wheat begins to promote these conditions, this leaky gut issue, the celiac disease issue, the heightened immune reactions within the body, all this stuff that begins to happen. So, like we said earlier, the wheat that's produced today is not like the wheat was produced 50 to 100 years ago. Those days are long gone. What's happening is in this country is people are eating a wheat that's treating it's the non-organic, by the way. So, but it's being treated with something called a glyphosate, okay, or a glyphosate, however you want to say it. But this is one of the glyphosate is one of the most widely used herbicides in the world, and it's an active ingredient in Monsanto's chemical called Roundup. And just side note, my suggestion is avoid anything that Monsanto produces or makes, but that's my opinion. But at any rate, it's an extremely widely used herbicide, and this herbicide has been shown to severely damage our guts, digestive flora, and to cause chronic disease rooted primarily in a gut that doesn't work or gut dysfunction. So, and by the way, glyphosate was actually patented as an antibiotic. Okay, but this is being very, very widely used in what's called the desiccation of non-organic wheat. And basically, what happens is just before they harvest the wheat, is they will treat it with this glyphosate. And so when the mature wheat gets exposed to this toxic chemical, the glyphosate, it's going to release more seeds, and this is going to result in a higher yield for the farmer, okay? So obviously higher yields mean more money for them. So that's why they do it. So these non-organic farmers are just trying to produce more. That's what's happening with GMOs too. And there's a whole bunch of issues with GMOs. When you start playing around with your food source, that's where you start to see all these sorts of challenges begin to happen. Okay? So, but all that really means is that most all non-organic wheat and all the processed foods that are going to contain it, because there's a lot of processed foods that have wheat flour in them, they're going to be contaminated with this glyphosate. And that can potentially have way, way, way more serious and detrimental health ramifications for us. So we really, really want to avoid it, okay? So the use of this glyphosate on wheat, became more popular about 15, 20 years ago, somewhere in there. So about 15 to 20 years ago, it really started getting more popular. And by doing it, they've seen a rise along with this in celiac disease. So I don't know. Is it just sort of I don't know. I guess I look at it as I step back when I see stuff like that. I go, there's got to be something here. In other words, this isn't totally random here. Something's going on. But something to think about. But a statement from Dr. Mercola here says glyphosate appears to attach to the gliadin as a consequence of a chemical reaction. And by interfering with the protein connections, glyphosate makes the wheat highly indigestible, more so than it already is, and more likely to cause an immune reaction and gut dysbiosis. Okay? Now, what's interesting is that there are people that are gluten intolerant or gluten sensitive in the United States, but then they travel over to Europe and they don't have any problems. Okay, so the reason is because they don't do this over there. They're not putting this drug, this chemical from Monsanto on the wheat prior to harvesting it. So something to think about. So it's gonna the whole grain breads in Europe, as an example, are still going to contain gluten. It just may not cause the problem because it doesn't have the chemical on there. And that's really what a lot of people are believing more than anything else is that the problems that are attributed to gluten are probably more, in fact, related to the chemicals used during the processing of the refined wheat flour than the actual gluten by itself. So, that's why eating organic and eating clean foods and things that are grown whole and not hybridized or genetically modified or anything like that is so important to you and I. It's not just some fad. It really is it is an idea for people that are concerned about what it is that they're putting into their body. And it's funny, last night my daughter was asking me about we're talking about doing some commercials for the program, and she said, "Have you done the commercials yet?" And I said, "No, not yet. Why do you ask?" And she goes, "Well, I'll be in it." This is my 10-year-old daughter. And I said, "Oh, yeah, what would you say?" She would say, "Well, you got to do Nutrimost because it's going to help your body, and, you only get one body to live in, so you want to take great care of it and eat real food." And I just thought, wow, I guess I'm having a little bit of an impact on her. But that was such a true statement, is that when you think about eating non-GMO foods and you think about eating organic and you think about eating real or taking real whole food live source supplementation as an example and getting the right fluids in, avoiding sugars and bad fats, trans fats, the processed, highly refined omega-6 oils. When you focus on avoiding these things and instead giving your body real things, it's really crazy how it begins to improve, along with the process that we utilize through Nutrimost, which is to then obviously stimulate rebalance. Because what happens is with a lot of people is when they consume these things over time, and we've already talked about many, many times, not only on my radio shows but on this call, is all of the hormone and neurotransmitter disruptors that people have consumed over the years. So getting those things back in balance is so darned important, okay? So just understanding gluten and understanding what it is and being a person that is thinking and living consciously is going to help you over time to make decisions that you can either live, you're going to live with, because you're not living with your head in the sand anymore, and that's really key. And so one thing I want to mention is gluten cross-reactivity, and that's just something you can Google that on your computer, and look for foods that will act like gluten. So if you happen to be a gluten-sensitive person, or you found that you're gluten-sensitive, there can be certain foods that are not gluten-containing, but they actually act like gluten. It's called cross-reactivity, okay? So that's something you can check out. And then, of course, there is a website that you can go to called celiac.com, which also, that website, you're going to find a big list of label ingredients that typically contain hidden gluten. So if you're interested in knowing where hidden glutens may lie, go to that celiac.com webpage, and you'll be able to get a list of things there. All right, two final things that I want to mention. I got this from Dr. Mercola as well. Two additional culprits he talks about are panification and wheat milling. So he mentioned that aside from glyphosate contamination, the other potential issues is how wheat is milled, how wheat is milled, and then this process of panification. I'm not going to go into the milling process itself, but you want to understand that, once again, when they throw these chemicals on there to create a higher yield, it's going to create some problems. And in terms of the food processing industry, the milling process has become infected by that as well. And that has started to create challenges with the grain itself, okay? But panification is a process of baking the bread, and this has undergone some pretty substantial changes over the years as well. In the past, when bakers would make bread, they would mix the flour with water and yeast, and then the dough would just be left to rise overnight. In other words, they would let it sit for 18 to 24 hours. And what this would do is the enzymes within the yeast would break down the gluten. And so these enzymes are not in our body. Our body lacks these particular enzymes and doesn't replicate them in the breakdown process. So this period of 18 to 24 hours allowed the enzymes within the bread to do it for us. They're not doing that anymore. Now what's happening, instead of letting the bread rise overnight, they're adding chemicals, which cuts down the process to about 2-3 hours at the most. And this obviously isn't a long enough period of time for the gluten to be broken down within the dough. Okay, so most bread today is going to contain way more indigestible gluten than breads in the past. Okay, or if you're going to a baker, locally or in Europe or whatever that's doing it the old-fashioned way, you may find that you don't have challenges with those types of breads. Okay, so once again, food for thought, and hopefully something for you to understand and think about. I wanted to tie in the reason why we suggest organic, non-GMO foods, eating meats that are raised humanely, that aren't fed a bunch of antibiotics or injected with a bunch of hormones, or fed non-GMO grains, where you're eating stuff that is basically grass-fed. You may find that some meats are grass-fed and grain-finished, for example, and I'm okay with that as long as they're non-GMO grains. So what that means is the cattle may eat grass for the majority of their life, and then the last 6 weeks they feed them a type of grain. And the cattle ranchers that are doing this are using non-GMO grains, and they're not using corn as an example. They won't use corn, but they'll finish them off with grains, and that'll help with the marbling in the meat as well. So, but anyway, being picky about the food you're eating is absolutely okay. I would happily accept the moniker of being a food snob, because I absolutely am. I love good food. I love real food. I love putting food in my body that I know is going to help to rebuild my body, support my body, and help it to function the way that God designed it to work. And I know that if you're doing the Nutrimos program and you're on this call or you're listening to this recording, you're one of those people too. So hopefully this provides you with a little bit of insight about gluten and helps you understand why you're feeling so darn good on this program. It's a multitude of things, but one of the reasons is we've eliminated gluten-containing foods while you're on it too. So I'll stop there, and I'll see if there are any questions. So give me just a minute here. Okay. If you want to email your questions to your liaisons, feel free to do that. Your liaisons can always pass those questions on to me before these calls, and I can answer the questions that way as well. So I'll go ahead and let you all go. I hope you all had a wonderful 4th of July. We'll be back here next Thursday. Have a great weekend, and keep focusing on your good health, and the weight will take care of itself. That I promise you. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.